This is Six African Trade Talks. Six African Trade Talks is a media partner of Intra-Africa Trade Fair, an initiative of Afreximbank in collaboration with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat and the African Union. In this episode, our guest is Wandile. Wandile is trained as an agricultural economist. He is the chief economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa and the author of Finding Common Ground, Land, Equity and Agriculture. He is also a senior lecturer extraordinary at the Department of Agriculture Economics at Stellenbosch University. Wandile, welcome to Six African Trade Talks. How are you?
Thanks for having me on, Jed. I'm doing good. Thank you.
Please take us through your brief background. How did you get into agriculture and where are you now?
Jed, we having this conversation. I am in Pretoria as I speak with you now. So background, how did I get into agriculture? I don't come from a farming background, but of course, this is a sector that where at university, where I studied agricultural economics at the University of Fort Hare in Alice in the Eastern Cape. And then from there, I went to a university, Stellenbosch University in the Western Cape, and to advance the study. And I joined the grain industry in the start of my career. And of course, over the years, I went to the Agricultural Business Chamber and worked for government and other various organizations. So it's been a fulfilling space, but also an important sector of our economy in South Africa, but of course, more so in the African continent, where we still, the numbers differ, but they still have roughly 60% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa involved in agriculture. And one can argue that when you look at the fortunes of sub-Saharan Africa, it can be made the point that roughly 23% or so is agriculture. So this is an important sector and the one that you can contribute something on it. And there's so much more, of course, exciting opportunities, which I think in this conversation we'll explore some of those.
Great. You're in a sector that is quite interesting. I remember speaking at agriculture conference in Dubai. And one of the things that I spoke about there was that it's very difficult for Africans to get into agriculture because as we're growing up, one of the punishment that's for us in Zimbabwe, and based on my experience, it could be different in other countries. But one of the things that would happen is if you have been a naughty child, you'll be sent to the garden. So agriculture became something that looked like a punishment. So it's quite an interesting space that you're in. What is the background of agriculture in South Africa?
Yeah, I think, Jen, you're making an important point there where you say when you were growing up, Zimbabwe, agriculture was seen as a sector where it's a heavy work and, of course, sometimes used as a punishment for kids. Because then it created this narrative where people do not see agriculture as a sector where there could be economic opportunities and they can have a better tomorrow. It is seen by some as a sector that is somewhat at a backward level onto that. But I think that's a simplistic view because if you analyze your life, you are interacting with agriculture every moment, every day. The clothes that you wear come from the agricultural sector. The food that you utilize throughout the day, it's agricultural sector. So it's all about that framing of how one saw as the sector. And I guess this is why even the young people sometimes, especially of the African origin, they tend to a certain extent, some not to be as interested in sector. It's those memories that you saw. But I think the idea, of course, is now to say, look, that was a smallholder agricultural sector defined by circumstances and the time that all of those events were happening. Right now, agriculture is an important sector of the economy. It has always been, but we are moving and commercializing and saying, can the young people make a better tomorrow, generate enough income and be able to sustain the households and their tomorrows working in the agricultural sector. And I think it's where we also beyond say, it's not that everyone has to be a farmer. Some can be scientists, some can be economists, some can be journalists, some can be all kinds of careers that can be connected to agriculture, either through services or practicing or operational within the sector. And changing the framing of it from a smallholder-centric view to saying, can we move towards commercial and financial sustainable one and making the sector to be more profitable and attractive for young people to come in? And I think that changes because it fights those stereotypes or those old experience people have of the sector, and they begin to see it as any primary sector like mining or whatever that can actually be productive. And I think it's an exciting time, Chad, because there's technologies and other things that actually help to improve productivity and make working in the sector not as hard and difficult work like in the olden days, but doing things more efficiently and productively. So those are some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about, Chad. And I mean, these are questions that I grapple with in South Africa today, because we have a sector that is dualistic. It has a certain side that is commercial and large scale, mainly white South Africans. And there's the other side of it that is small scale, mainly Black South African. Productivity levels are low. And the question that we're grappling with, and this is something that I discuss in my upcoming book in September this year, which talks about how do you close this dualism? And I think the lessons that I'm trying to grapple with are some that will be useful not only in South Africa, but thinking about the African continent to say, how do we modernize and improve productivity and drive this sector forward? So these are some of the things, Chet, that I think are very important when we think about, and it is an economic perspective and the incomes of those that would be involved in.
Interesting. Thank you very much for sharing those insights. And it's exciting to hear about agriculture. What is Africa importing that can be grown on the continent? And what's stopping us from achieving that?
I think, Chad, the African continent, of course, we still struggle with the issue of low agricultural productivity. There's important work that has been done by people like Tom Jane, who's a professor of agricultural economics at Michigan State University. Our colleagues, BFEP, Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, like Ferdy Mayer, Tracy, Davids, and the others, looking at the African continent and thinking about the issues of agricultural productivity. Some of the studies have come up showing that over time, the improvements that we've seen in the yields in Africa has largely been about the expansion in area planted. It is only of the past few years where there's some evidence from colleagues, Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, that's BFEP, saying, look, there is also some changes in productivity, some green shoots that we are seeing here and there. But the point is there's still a productivity question in Africa. And this links to your question then, which is say, what are we importing? Because we could improve agricultural productivity, but there's a number of things that are constraining us. Either it's more on adoption of technology. It has a lot to do with low levels of investments, with mechanization levels that are low, all of those things. To the extent that now we're spending a lot of money as Africa importing a range of agricultural products. If you take the entire continent, a year on average, we spend about $80 billion importing food into Africa. Now, you take away the Maghreb region and you focus on the sub-Saharan Africa region, we spend roughly on average about $40 billion a year importing products. You look into this and say, what is it that is Africa that we are importing? At the top, we have wheat, we have rice, palm oil, and we have, of course, maize, we have sunflower seeds, soybean seeds, and some a range of processed food products and poultry. And then why look at the and what are some of the things that we can produce? We can expand our rice production to a certain extent. We can improve our wheat production to a certain extent, even if we don't completely eliminate them, because the climatic conditions play a role in here. But I do think that with certain areas, there are improvements that can be made. On soybean, thinking about the regional value chains, we can do a lot on improving the production there. Same as poultry and sunflowers. And these are some of the crops that I think with levels of investments, levels of focus, favorable policy, favorable land governance, we can be able to see the improvements and reduce this import. If anything, we keep importing then some of the products that our environment doesn't allow us to produce, but we slowly move forward with producing more of some of the products that our environment permits so that we export those into the world market to an extent that when you look at our trade balance, we can at least now start to register a trade surplus as the African continent. But of course, today, the numbers still look very bad, and there's a lot of work that to be done to agricultural activity and value chains across the African continent.
That points out to a lot of opportunities. Our challenges on the continent, some of them are our greatest opportunities. We hope that we'll be able to turn around and really feed the world. How can we attract investment in agriculture?
Jed, we've been talking about we can turn around and really feed the world. But I do think that there needs to be some practical steps that are being taken by the African continent. You think back and all of these summits that we get to have with the African governments, sitting down, thinking about, the future, the potential, more land unplanted, favorable climatic condition. But it remains that, the potential. There's certain things that needs to be done to actually move the dial forward this time around. And I think that today's environment where there are all of these wars in Ukraine, Russia, and the impact they present to global food supplies, and you had the COVID and the disruption in supply chains, these are some of the things that should wake us up to say, look, we really need to do something as a continent, improve production and attract investment, and of course, strengthen the regional supply chains. And some of these things, they have to start at a fundamental level, because I do think that most African governments, perhaps with the exception of countries like South Africa, Zambia, and a few others, they need to do a lot by improving public infrastructure, roads, the railway line, as well as water supplies. Those are the things that they should utilize their budgets to improve. Because if the roads and the water supply, railway lines, and energy is improved, then the private sector is able to come in and invest in the agro-processing, invest in the certain supply chains that will be able to connect farmers with the regional markets, with export markets. So the public sector should invest on those. And I think the other thing that the governments should be thinking about is saying, how do they strengthen land governance? Because if you think and you look across the African continent, we remain with a major challenge whereby about 86% of the land plots are still unregistered. And then if you have that much, over 80% of the African land plots unregistered, it's very hard to think about long-term investments to fruits, high-value crops when we don't have strong land governance. And I think we need to do something by improving that. And I do think that the African governments have to be open to technology. Either it's agrochemicals, pesticides, improved genetic material on seeds, because all of those are things that boost productivity. We see gains of that in South Africa, where they've been open to some of these technologies. And this is a country that is semi-arid, and some of the African countries have much better climate than South Africa. Agricultural productivity is low, so we need to be open to the technology angle. And I do think that, Chad, there's a lot to be said of formalizing the value chains. I know many people like the whole idea of saying, look, informal sector, lots of job, lots of vibrancy. But that means that our food systems remain fragile. We need to ensure that the informality thing, we deal with it to attract more investment. So there's a lot of things, Chad, that can be done. But I think in brief, investing in public infrastructure, improving land governance, making sure that the rules of the games are clear on that, and of course, strengthening the rule of law. Those are some of the things that I think at the very start, they will begin to make investors to look at the continent and say, hey, there's climatic conditions that are favorable. There's infrastructure. Land governance is clear. There's population growth. Maybe we can do something here. There are opportunities. But until we do that, this will remain a potential and we'll never be able to see the gain of it. And such a future will be very depressing for a continent with so many young people. So we need to address this issue.
Very interesting insights. As you were talking, one of the memories that came out is a book I read by Leonardo Di Sotto and The Mystery of Capital. So Africa has got a lot of opportunities, a lot of potential, especially in agriculture. But these are the missing dots as you were taking us through, that if we could just get right, we'll be able to really realize our full potential. So thank you very much for sharing. So Wandile, you spoke about technology. There's been an issue when it comes to different types of technology. I remember, I'm from Zimbabwe, so I remember the issue of GMO. It's a topical issue, but we'll leave that for now. Agri-tech and the future of agriculture with technology. What's your view?
Jed, I think, in fact, I'm going to insist and start with the first point that you raised, because when we think about agriculture technology, we're thinking about it both biological and mechanical. It makes no sense to only focus on mechanical, whereby you have drones and all of these things. What are they going to be moving? The mechanical side of technology is as when you have the biologicals that help us to improve the productivity and have the yields and have the product, that then we can analyze and use all of the data that we generate to continuously improve and use other technologies to connect our value chains. But I do think that the African governments should study some of the countries that have adopted certain agrochemicals and certain things. I mentioned South Africa already, but you can look at South America, look at the US and say, how can we work around and adopt some of these technologies? At the end of last year, I was very heartened to watch what was happening in Kenya. President Ruto, who's a scientist, saying, look, guys, let's be open to genetically modified maize and plant it here in Kenya. And then, of course, the activists took over the issue in February. And now President Ruto is in court and all of those things. And in Zimbabwe, they are open for imports of genetically modified maize from South Africa. But the plantation of it is still not fully open in Zimbabwe, which then puts Zimbabwean farmers at a disadvantage because they're competing with higher yields and large harvest out of South Africa. But the level of a playing field is not equal for everyone. They are not having the technologies that South African farmers, yet they get to have to compete onto that. So these are things that I think the Africans, we have to start studying them. And if there are areas where we are uncomfortable, where we say, look, it's these companies owning all of the seeds. Tomorrow they can decide to wake up and go, and then we're left with those seeds. Then we have to work on a regulation that can actually prevent those things instead of just denying the technology completely out. So that's the one part of this. And it's not only the genetics in as far as it comes to crops. We have to think about genetics in livestock. We have to think about genetics across all of those things. And I think with climate change and the difficulties it presents, these are important questions to have, because think about it, in East Africa, over the past 3 years, heavy drought that has been affecting people, fall armyworm and all of the crop diseases. But if those were to fall in certain parts of South Africa and Zambia, where there's certain agrochemicals that are registered, you find that these farmers are able to deal with those. But in East Africa, where some of the farmers are unable to deal with some of these diseases that are brought by climate change. So we need to be really thinking about technology in the biological side. But of course, there's a lot of work that can be done in the mechanical side, either by utilizing the AI and all of the other technologies and opening up digital marketplaces. I'm thinking of South Africa now. We have what we call Kula, which is a digital marketplace for fresh produce, input use. They are assisting even farmers, nutrients, people that are coming into agriculture, and even the commercial farmers onto that. It assists with price discovery, great competition. But there's also some of the technologies in the mechanical side. But farmers will be able to afford the large mechanical use of technology when they've been able to get good yields and made money, and then they can be able to buy some of these things. So technology is out there. It provides many opportunities, but I think the regulatory environment has to be favorable for people to farm profitable while producing food that is safe and nutritious for consumers, which is what the regulators should be looking at instead of actually blocking some of the things. So these are some of the things that we have to grapple with as the continent in order, Chad, to realize the potentials, which in essence, yes, technology holds a lot of opportunity and moving the African continent towards that promising future that we all want to see. But I think the regulators have to be cognizant and work in a modern way, understanding the complexity of the environment at which we are in now as the world.
Interesting. It's always interesting to hear views of agronomists or economists in agriculture and how they see some of these things, because sometimes you hear people having opinions, but they might not have the knowledge, especially when it comes to the technical background of the knowledge. Value addition and agro-processing. What is your view and where are we going as Africa and what is the potential?
Yeah, there's a lot of potential there. At this point, if you just look at the imports by the African continent, there's still a large share of products of processed foods that are imported in the African continent. And I think there's a lot of value that can be done on processing a range of products. And it's also an area where I see opportunities for job creation, because of course, the job creation at a farm level, but there's also opportunities that lie on the value chain. And I think we can do a lot on that. And we'll be able to do a lot of us when we have the volumes, when we have improved productivity, and we have the structure that connects consumption points and the production points. chains are fragmented as they are today. And I think there's a much more for the continent to realize. In fact, when I think about the promise of agriculture in Africa, Jed, I'm always thinking about it from a primary and an agro-processing perspective, because we have this huge dividend that is coming up and they can do a lot on agro-processing. And I think the technology, the skill, there's a lot more opportunities that lie there. But it's also an area where investors have to be looking and say, how can I add value within the value chain in Africa's agriculture? Before farm level, which is these inputs and things that we're talking about, but also post farm level and saying on storage, on processing certain commodities, packaging, cold chain construction, and all of those things. These are areas that the investors have to be looking when there is certainty and there is a clear rule of law to protect them and the rules of the game are clear. And of course, they will participate in this space. But I see much more growth also within this agro-processing space. And indeed, the entire value chain of the food, fiber, and beverages sector.
As you're speaking, it's one of the memories that you've brought is that you look at just what Woolies in South Africa is now packaging and selling. One would have never thought that you will have dried bananas being sold, things like that. And when you now go deep down in different parts in Africa, you'll see plantain. Some of it actually goes bad. Bananas. There's a lot of wastage that happens deep down on the productive side, which if we could process it, there's a lot of value that can be created and exported. So thank you very much for sharing that. What is the impact of the AFCFTA in agriculture?
The African Continental Free Trade Agreement holds great potential for the sector, Chad, and many of the countries, of course, intertrade in Africa remains fairly small. If you look at it in value terms, just intertrade, I think it's just north of $24 billion when we think about agriculture. And I've made the point that we're importing over $40 billion of over $40 billion of agricultural products as the sub-Saharan Africa. As the entire continent, we import around $80 billion of agricultural products. Now, if you think about those import level and you think about intertrade still just over $24 billion, that means there's a lot more that can be done. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, lowering barriers for trade is important. But I do think that for us to fully realize the potential, we have to think about infrastructure and say, do we have the infrastructure to be able to move these commodities fairly across the continent? And the governments have to be building some of these over the years. And the secondary one, which links us back to the previous point, Chad, is the harmonization of standards in agriculture, the products. Because some of the countries, to the point I was making earlier, if you think about Kenya today, Kenya needs to import about 700,000 tons of maize. South Africa has over 3 million tons of maize for export markets. But Kenya cannot import much of its maize from South Africa. And in fact, if you look at the Kenyan maize imports bill, only about 10% of it or less comes from South Africa. The reason being that the genetically modified crops, certain agrochemicals that are used as non-tariff barriers. But the minute we have harmonization of standards, I'm using maize in this particular case as an example, but there's much harmonization in standards that needs to be done. And we need to think about deeply as we implement this African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I think it holds the potential, but we just have to clear up the non-tariff barriers about the harmonization of standards, deal with the infrastructure. But essentially, for all countries to benefit, we have to deal with agricultural productivity levels. Because if we don't deal with productivity questions, you will have trade where South Africa and Zambia and the others are sending a lot more products into the world, into the continent. But they are not receiving much back because there's lower volumes in other countries. But for this to be really fair trade, we have to think about raising agricultural productivity and making sure that those countries with capacity to invest in processing, they can invest, and then they can get raw material from other African countries. And then there we can have fair trade and everyone can benefit onto that. But until that day, there will still be skewed trade patterns. There will be discomforts, even if they are not voiced fairly well. Just to think about 22, one meat-placed trade bans on South African vegetables. because they were saying, look, you're sending a lot of your vegetable here, and some farmers, we still need to grow our vegetable industry. But if those farmers were allowed and open to certain technologies that are in South Africa, you get to have an open channel, you have a sharing of knowledge, and you have a movement of products across countries. And so those are realities practically, Jed, we have to deal with. While at a political level, it's all good and we're ironing up now, implementing this. And then the business community, which is the conversation that you yourself and the others in Cape Town were discussing, has to begin then to say the practicalities of trade, the practicalities of productivity, all of this thing. But overall, I'm positive there's an opportunity, but so much work in the near term.
Interesting times ahead of us. Any podcast or book you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
I think I'll recommend one book, given the times we're in for your listeners. I'll recommend a book titled Narrative Economics by Robert Shiller. Bob Shiller is a Nobel laureate in economics at Yale. It talks about how stories and news can drive markets. And I think what we saw in the banking crisis and how the narratives moved markets behavior in the regional banks in the US, but also just in general, how news and the sentiment shift markets is an important subject to understand. And I think your listeners can by reading Bob Shiller's Narrative Economics book.
Great. Perfect. Thank you very much. To support our show, please leave a review and share this episode. You can also connect with us on social media using the handles in our show notes, or visit our website, scixpodcast.africa. See you next time.